As you might hear, I don't have a voice, which might make it one of my better speeches, which could be setting a low bar. I was speaking to one of my chief executives of those many companies that Jennifer referred to this afternoon, and he said, "It sounds as though you've got about half a voice." And I said, "Yes, and I'm going to make a speech in a couple of hours about federalism." And he said, "Well, you've got half a voice and they've got half a chance of ever fixing it." So I think in a sense that is probably where I'm going to start and finish. Robert asked that I might talk a little about my perspective of where hopefully this might come out and what the political obstacles are for anything productive to happen. I was part of the previous New Federalism, which was a creature of Bob Hawke's, and I guess I was the leading state participant almost a quarter of a century ago. I think my starting point is that the Abbott New Federalism runs a bit of a danger of becoming a captive of the bureaucracy. I noticed when I came back from overseas a few days ago, minus a voice, that there is a steering group, and the steering group is made up of the Directors General of each state Premier's department. And you would guess my reaction was that that wasn't necessarily a certain way of getting the most risk-taking and productive approach to what is a fraught subject. But my overlying point is that this is political. I don't mean Liberal Labor political, and no doubt end up a bit that way. But this needs to be seen as overwhelmingly part of the Australian body politic of how we govern ourselves and how we'll govern ourselves going forward. There's been no serious review of the Federation in the 115 years since Australia was created. There was none at the centenary of Federation, which is the sort of time when politicians usually decide, gee, it's 100 years on, maybe we should have a look at it. And there has been, I think it's fair to say, with the exception of Prime Minister Hawke, there has been very little interest in this subject by either side of politics, and state or federal, throughout the 115 years of Australian political history. So I do think that one of the starting points in terms of making real progress is that this is so complex, so difficult, so readily captured by vested interests of one sort or another, that unless one can acquire a significant amount of bipartisan support, by which I mean both sides of politics and equally federal and state levels, I think one's chances are very small indeed. The starting point, I think, is that you need an agreed statement of principles. Unfortunately, they tend to be words like sovereignty and subsidiarity and things like that, which aren't exactly going to catch the front page of the Daily Telegraph. But unless we get an agreed set of principles as to how the Federation might improve, and they are things like ensuring some clarity, some sovereignty for different levels of government. They are things like subsidiarity, getting things done at the level that most applies, and so on. Unless you get an agreed set of principles, if you devolve automatically, as you tend to do, and as our conversation today probably will, if you devolve automatically to the detail, then it is very, very hard. You really do need to try and get some momentum behind the idea that the Federation as it now exists is dysfunctional, is broken, because without that, if you start trying to talk, as Jeremy will, about health or about different functional areas, you wouldn't want to put the family jewels on getting an agreement, especially given that no federal government is going to want constitutional referenda to try and implement anything. So I suspect you need other, well not I suspect, I'm sure you need other forms of structuring and enforcing this. and they're not altogether easy to find. So, who should own it? I think one of the sad things is that Tony has started this as a Commonwealth and almost a Commonwealth bureaucracy white paper. I think the chances would be a lot better if it was owned by the Federation, if it was owned by the 7 governments rather than by the federal government. Because, I mean, this is ultimately the most mutual thing all these governments do. And I would have thought the appropriate ownership is, in fact, COAG, call it what you like, structure it as you like, but if you wanted to succeed, you're better off having some commonality of ownership. I'm a bit afraid, and I hope I'm wrong, that what's going to happen is there's some very well-meaning, intelligent people in the Prime Minister's department who will beaver away on various papers which they've announced in the last few weeks, and the Directors General at state of various Premier's departments around the state will sort of ride roughshod and make sure no one says anything terribly radical. I would have thought the reverse is much better. Try and have it owned by everyone, because at the end of the day it's got to be owned by everyone. It's not capable of meaningful implementation if it's contested in a serious way as between the Commonwealth and the states. My next sort of general point, and I will be very brief for my sake as well as yours. I think the next thing to say is you do need bold strokes. This will only, in my view, work if the paper and the set of ideas, which hopefully this little discussion and others are part of, you really need not to say, well, let's have a little incremental change. No doubt there are some useful incremental changes you can make, but this is about a new federalism. It is seriously about changing what has been a one-way slide for the last 75 years in terms of the dysfunctionality, in the sense that we have lousy accountability, we have no match between who raises money and who spends it, and all the other things that you're all aware of. So I do think you're looking for big, bold strokes and big, bold decisions to start with, which goes with my notion that you need a set of principles as to what you're trying to achieve, rather than, how do we better fund education? Should they get rid of 700 public servants in Canberra from the schools area? They probably should, but that's not exactly the point of trying to reform the Federation. Incidentally, I think if people read the Commission of Audit, I think my friend Joe Hockey could have done different timing with the release of the Commission of Audit. It got lost in the budget and it's been sort of lost ever since. I think it probably should have been released early, stood on its own feet, and a longer period of debate or narrative would have helped. But what they say on this stuff is entirely sensible. It's entirely sensible, and that's a dispassionate group of people from outside government, and they say intelligent things both about the short-term reduction in the number of federal-state agreements and, more importantly, the serious long-term work of allocating responsibilities, what I call who does what to whom and why. I do think, incidentally, that is the first question. It's easy to get diverted, and understandable getting diverted into vertical fiscal imbalance and how do we pay for it. But the basic question is, who does what to whom and why? Or who should do what to whom and why? And you've got to be prepared to have a sensible discussion, I guess is a popular word these days. You've got to be prepared to have a sensible discussion about that. I don't think you need to spend too much time arguing that you ought to have clarity and you shouldn't have duplication and triplication in almost every area. If that's not self-evident, then you really do have Buckleys of making serious progress. So the first issue is to get a clear statement of who does what to whom and why. And at the risk of being slightly radical, I'm not sure the actual answers always matter. What matters is the clarity. What matters, my old Cabinet Secretary Gary Sturgis no doubt stole from someone else the line about good fences make good neighbours. That's what this is about. You need good fences, and whether tertiary, whether TAFE becomes all Commonwealth or not, you can have profound discussions about, but low-level problem. The high-level problem is that everyone's got their finger in every pie, and that's a basis for the sort of dysfunction that we have at the moment. So that's, in my view, where it should start. I do think there's an argument about the total, and I don't know if I differ from CIS or not. I'm sure I'm wrong if I differ from CIS on this. I think there may be a discussion about the total amount of government that's what do people expect from governments, not state or federal? What do they expect from governments? What should they expect? And where does the accountability lie? So I think that discussion is worth having, because if you simply assume the answer, either the answer that existing government is the right size or is too big or is too small, you're not going to carry the public with you in a meaningful sort of way. Finally, look, I spent 1.5 years of my life on a horizontal fiscal equalisation study. I'm persuaded it's a low-level issue. I'm also persuaded I wasted 1.5 years of my life on it. But I knew that before I said yes to Treasurer Swan. But I wouldn't get carried away with that. The views of our committee and the views of the Commission of Audit are the same. In the long term, it probably ought to be equal per capita, and the 2 states and 2 territories that do need some long-term support, and I'm not sure South Australia will be there forever, but Tasmania and the territories, probably for different reasons, do require support, cross-subsidisation, whatever. I think that can happen directly from the Commonwealth. But in any case, for what it's worth, I think diverting one's energies into a politically barren debate about HFE is a waste of time. I point out only in passing that Colin Barnett, who started the debate that led to myself and 2 others wasting 1 year of our lives, he was doing very badly at the time because WA revenues were going like this. WA revenues for minor are going like this, and he's suddenly doing much better, and you'll notice that he's not quite as excited about HFE. That's all reasonable politics, but my point is, this discussion is so hard, you've got to focus on the hard question. Ultimately, it is, firstly, who does what to whom and why. Once you've resolved that, you've got to have a go at vertical fiscal imbalance and the range of issues around that. And just finally, before I show that I can go too long with half a voice, inevitably the VFI debate will either go down, there's not many options. It'll go down the path where the Commission of Audit went, where Malcolm Fraser, with input from me and others, went in the late 70s, which is some form of income tax space creation or income tax sharing between the Commonwealth and the states. Or it'll go the more fashionable way now, which is to change the GST. I suppose CIS would say the third way is just to spend less money in government, and you mightn't have to address that question. I accept that that's a plausible third option. But for what it's worth, because you've asked me here, on the GST, I do think on balance the GST ought to go up regardless of where you come out on the previous question. Assume you think government is the right size. Assume you think, as CIS does, it's too big. Let's accept that. I still think you need to change. You need more consumption tax. Any inquiry, doesn't matter whether they're from Washington, Paris, Burke or Galargenbone, anyone with half a brain will tell you that the composition of our tax structure doesn't rely heavily enough on GST. And so I would reform I would increase the GST, and where you come out in terms of how much you spend compensating the poorer part of the community, how much you spend getting rid of totally dysfunctional state taxes, of which there are still a lot, and how much you might spend in some sort of hypothecated way on health and disabilities, because if we're not honest with ourselves on health and on the NDIS, we're just going to have this debate for 30, 40 years, because the truth is everyone wants more money spent on health. Well, they want better health, and they certainly want a national disability insurance scheme. Neither of them are funded. Neither of them were funded under the last government. Neither of them are funded under this government. And I just think it's high time for some honesty about that. So how you spend the GST is a good question, and no doubt gets a lot of time. The important thing is to recognise that wherever you come out on the overall size of government, you should rely more heavily on consumption tax and less on all these transaction taxes and things that are around. I think, Jennifer, that must be my 10 or 15 minutes. Just for one final point, I am absolutely a fan of making federalism work. It does involve some giving back of effective power, and effective is the important word, to the states. However, I don't think you should throw the baby out with the bathwater. There has been some progress made in terms of national reporting, in terms of national information flows and so on. I mean, we are a nation of 22 million people. Doesn't mean we have to run our schools the same way or our hospitals, but it does mean that one should acknowledge that there is in many ways national markets for these different products and services, and I'd be reluctant to see all of the some reasonable progress in creating national approaches, not approaches in terms of mandating the way to do it, but approaches in terms of information flows and accountability. I'd hate to see that thrown out in this federalism discussion. But if I could finish where I started, I do think, for better or for worse, this is highly political. You only need to go back to the debates of the 1890s to see, this is about how we governed ourselves, and people got immensely wound up about it. They will get immensely wound up again about shifting if it's serious. If it's not serious, we're wasting our time. So my only point is we should all do what we can to try and build a consensus for a serious, non-partisan approach to a fair income look at the Federation. Without that, we're wasting our time. Thank you.